Well, thank you so much to the organizers for the opportunity to present today, and to the Champollion Foundation and Protocol Labs for sponsoring this awesome event and for the travel support. Before I dive in, I also just want to thank my esteemed collaborators on this project, Juncal Arbelaiz and Jonathan Pillow, as well as a bunch of people at Princeton for very interesting and insightful conversations, and my funding sources for this project. So, how can dynamical systems learn to perform useful tasks? How does this occur in the brain? And how can we achieve this in artificial networks in interpretable and predictable ways? So there's a lot of interesting work in this domain, which I think we'll continue to hear more about throughout this meeting. But one kind of canonical brain-inspired success story is that of Hebbian plasticity, energy landscapes, and attractors. So Hebbian plasticity is the classic plasticity rule that neurons that fire together wire together. And this is a very intuitive way of physically binding information together. And it also has a lot of in vitro support. What's more, there's a very rich theory around Hebbian plasticity showing that if you wire together networks with this learning rule, you can create networks whose dynamics can be very well described by the movement of the neural or network state down an energy landscape where the minima correspond to fixed point attractors. And so this has gained very wide appeal because it provides a way of understanding in a somewhat intuitive but also theoretically grounded form what might otherwise be quite complex collective dynamics. And this can be used to perform useful computations, such as pattern completion. Nonetheless, there's reason to believe that this is not the end of the story, and Hebbian theory actually has a lot of limitations. First, it is unclear how Hebbian rules can produce more general purpose dynamics, such as precision limit cycles, line attractors, or modeling external system dynamics. This is quite challenging to do with Hebbian rules. And second, there's mounting experimental evidence that some of the strongest and strongest plasticity rules acting in vivo do not, in fact, have this Hebbian flavor. So, for instance, in hippocampus, cerebellum, and mushroom body, the plasticity rules, or some of the most salient plasticity rules, seem to obey what we have named PRISM, or presynaptic and instructive signal mediated plasticity. Sorry, I changed the acronym since submitting the abstract. But this is slightly more complex than Hebbian theory. So in addition to having presynaptic inputs and an output neuron, there is a third player, which is sometimes called an instructive signal, that modulates this plasticity. And what happens is that, unlike Hebbian theory, where plasticity would be triggered by the presynaptic and output or postsynaptic neuron coincident activation, in these areas, the plasticity seems to be triggered by coincident or approximately coincident activation of the presynaptic and instructive signal. And this will evoke a weight change from the presynaptic neuron's synapse onto the postsynaptic neuron. Now, there is a lot of variation across these brain areas as to the physical instantiation of this plasticity rule, as well as the sign of plasticity that is invoked, and the specific temporal windows that are used or that are involved in this plasticity. Nonetheless, they share the common feature that plasticity is induced by presynaptic and instructive signal coincidence or approximate coincidence, but expressed at the presynaptic to postsynaptic synapse. What's more is that this plasticity rule in the brain appears to occur within relatively stereotyped circuit architectures. So in particular, this plasticity rule seems to occur within what you might call feedback circuits, leaning on the theme of this conference. So you can think of hippocampus, cerebellum, and mushroom body as sort of feedback circuits attached to the rest of the brain. And these feedback circuits are also kind of stereotyped. So the presynaptic side of the plastic weights here is thought to exhibit something like what I've called a high-dimensional barcoding layer, meaning high-dimensional, random-looking, often sparse codes for various inputs. And at least in cerebellum and mushroom body, the postsynaptic side here is a much lower dimensional, so a much smaller number of neurons in this downstream layer. Although in hippocampus, it's a little more complicated. Right, and so all of these, the motif is very similar, but of course the cell types and the names are different. Yes, and then in addition, we now have our instructive signals. So here I've just made it bold, so this is a vector. And for instance, in the mushroom body, there's a dopamine neuron, this instructive signal, for every output neuron. So there are multiple instructive signals. So what happens when, or what kind of effect does this type of plasticity rule have on dynamics? To address this, we studied a mathematical model. All right, so hopefully it's not too late for just a couple equations. But we used a model in which the complete system dynamics are written as follows. So dx dt is given by some base term, so this could be whatever Rn you like, in addition to some external inputs. And then we also have this feedback circuit here, where this psi represents our kind of barcode-like representation. W are the plastic weights inside the feedback circuit, and then C are the weights that go from the feedback circuit back to the rest of the system. And you can choose various things for psi, but one example that's at least a little bit easier to work with is a random matrix multiplied by the system state passed through a nonlinearity like a sigmoid. So we can think of psi as a barcode, not say for sensory stimuli, but for the system state. And now we add in our plasticity rule. So we write this down as, this is just the vector format, where you can see that the change in weight is given by the outer product of the instructive signal vector with the state barcode. And for the record, this is a first-order model of the rules I just described from biology. In particular, there is no temporal kernel here, and we have also said that, that positive instructive signals yield potentiation in these weights. But hopefully I will convince you this is a useful and potentially even interesting first-order model. All right, so what happens when we turn this on? And in particular, what happens when we drive this system with inputs and instructive signals? And kind of the main finding for this study is that we can describe what happens in a sort of intuitive geometric way, and that is via the observation that instructive signals and prism plasticity adds what I have, or what we have termed support states. So for simplicity, if we start with our system with these weights being 0, just to keep things simple, and we'll also consider that the base dynamics here are very, very simple, so this could just be minus x, so everything just flows down to this 0th fixed point before any learning happens. But now what we'll do is drive the system with some input u, and this will move the system state around, around the state space. And then at a single point, when the system is at a location x star, we're just going to apply a delta pulse instructive signal, where this alpha star corresponds to the relative components on each of the instructive signal components, or the relative weights of the instructive signal components. And what this does is this updates W through our plasticity rule and produces a new W that's not 0 anymore. And what we found was that if you take all the math you learned in your machine learning courses about support vector machines, and it's actually not that much, it's just a couple of lines, and you apply it, you can rewrite the final dynamics, not in terms of this W anymore, but in terms of what we have C times this alpha star times this K variable, which is called a kernel function. And so what this kernel function does is it specifies how near an arbitrary state x is to the location at which the instructive signal was applied. And in support vector machines, this would be called a support vector, but because we're in the world of dynamical systems and state spaces, we've called this a support state. And we have also called this the dual form of the dynamics, also borrowing from the SVM terminology. Right, and so geometrically what's happening is we started with these base dynamics, and then when we added the support state, what this does is it adds a patch of flow field that is pointed roughly in a direction given by C times alpha star, and that spreads out or decays according to the shape of this kernel function. And then what we have is the final flow field is the sum of the base dynamics plus this patch added by the instructive signal via the support state. And in this case, we get 2 fixed points, so you can create nonlinear behaviors in this way. And the most general form is to sum over all the support states, which correspond to 1 per instructive signal impulse added. And what you'll find is that this ends up being a very, very flexible term because each support state through this K function ends up acting like a basis function. And so you can basically add together a bunch of basis functions to produce a lot of flexible behaviors. And here's just some examples. You can create multiple fixed points. You can create limit cycles. You can create an approximate line attractor. And you can check our preprint, but we've shown how you can add these support states online by designing your inputs and instructive signals correctly. And here's just an example of a limit cycle showing that it is stable to perturbations, and also that when you add more support states, you can have better accuracy at making these very precise by decreasing the error. Similarly, a line attractor can integrate at least reasonably well and much better than a network with no training. And so at the end of the day, the flexibility in this plasticity rule comes from the flexibility you have in choosing the instructive signal time course. So my colleague Juncal Arbaliz showed that you can also, using the same formulation, cause a network to emulate an external system by driving or by locking this instructive signal to a tracking error between an RNN state, the RNN state, and some target state. And for example, you can convert this kind of boring linear flow field to a van der Pol oscillator. You can also erase or overwrite existing dynamics and convert, in this case, a bistable attractor to this oscillator. And this kind of calls back some older work in adaptive control theory and motor learning. So in summary, how do we train dynamical systems to perform useful tasks? We suggested that all you need, maybe, is this prism plasticity rule applied to a feedback circuit, which is very, very biologically inspired. And in complement to the theory of Hebbian plasticity and energy landscape and attractors, this prism plasticity rule creates support states which could create quite flexible dynamics. This also provides a very kind of interpretable solution for the post-learning dynamics, revealing a fairly concise link in this model between the dynamics and the network connectivity. And what's nice about these kernel methods is that you can predict the generalization beyond the support states in a quite clean way, which might not be the case if you were training a deep network for the dynamics, for instance. Finally, you can check our preprint, but we're also working on how to apply this to a more conventional machine learning context when you have a bunch of inputs and output examples. And I just want to end by noting that in this kind of emerging world of neuro AI, it can be very interesting to compare the brain to deep networks and transformers and that kind of thing. But in addition to this, we may still have much to gain by keeping in mind the good old SVM. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.